In this unit, we're going to start to talk about deviance and social control. There's a lot of content and a lot of theories, both sociologically, biologically, and cognitively, about why deviant behavior occurs. I strongly encourage spending a lot of time in this unit, as you will definitely need to reread some of the theories a few times. But let's start with some of the overview for this. So deviant behavior is really any behavior that's going to fail to conform to the rules or the norms of the group in question. It's definitely relative. So deviance can be relative because it can be based on a number of factors. Just like we talked about social interaction happens with a number of factors, same here. The audience is one of the factors. So whether or not something is considered deviant depends on who you're doing it in front of. Something very deviant in front of your parents may not be deviant in front of a peer group at all. The second element is really time. So think back to the 1950s. Smoking cigarettes inside your home, not an issue. Many families did it. They thought it was the common norm at the time. And if you had folks over to dinner parties, that's just what happened. In today's society, inviting folks over, having a large frequency of smoking cigarettes inside is not viewed in the same way it was. So time is often an element. Next is the individual, him or herself. Thinking of how that person shows up. Earlier we talked about in some of the previous chapters status and roles. Think about if the person is homeless or maybe a CEO of a company. They may be treated very differently by law enforcement, by other people on the street. So the individual themselves plays a factor in whether or not you think something they're doing is deviant. For example, if you looked at the CEO on the street and they were dressed poorly, or maybe they had a gash to their knee, you might question it and try and get them help. Whereas right or wrong, you might see a homeless person with the same physical outcome, gash on their knee, maybe they're not dressed well, but because you see them as the homeless person, you don't treat them in the same way and get them the help. So again, not saying it's a judgment thing necessarily, but the person themselves will often factor into what you believe to be deviant or not in that scenario. And finally, the place. So think about yelling at a baseball game. Probably not all that deviant. You can cheer, you can be loud. But if you were yelling at the opera, it would be a very, very different scenario, and you'd probably be disciplined for that based solely on the place. Now, like I said, there's going to be a lot of biological, psychological, and social explanations for why people are deviant. We're only going to have time to cover a few here, but I'm going to try and cover some, such as Merton's strain theory, that really have a lot of elements that I hope I can help explain a little bit better. So Merton's strain theory, if you remember back to the very beginning, we talked about Merton, and he talked about latent and manifest functions when we talked about functionalism. Well, he also has to do with deviance. And deviance, he says, is often because of a breakdown between the goals and the means of society. Well, what does that mean? Well, he talks about the goals being the things that society tells you you need to achieve, and the means being how socially accepted ways to go about those attainments. So for example, the American dream in its utmost kind of sense is this white picket fence outside your house, living with the 2.3 children and the dog. Well, society also says you're supposed to do that through working hard, having a job, potentially going to school, all of those elements. So there's well-established goals and means as a society. Now, the white picket fence and house is a little extreme, but you get the general idea. Merton was really fascinated with the idea of what he called the strain, the breakdown or the strain between those goals and the means to obtain the goals. And they said often it's really hard to obtain the goals society sets forth in the ways that they prescribe, and he believed that deviance was a result of that strain between the goals and sometimes the means to obtain those goals. So he developed what he called the typology of responses, and don't worry about the word typology, it just essentially means different types of responses, and we're going to look at each of those. So his first type was a conformist. In conformity, he says you, as a person, get the goals of society, you understand the means of society, there's no deviance. So in this example, you might be going to college right now because you believe that in order to get ahead, you're going to need a job that will require a degree, and that degree needs to come now. That's a conformist. You're kind of going about things in the right way. Maybe you want to purchase a candy bar. This is a very simple example. But you want to purchase it, society says you have to pay for that, and so you go about the means properly to get money through a job or maybe money through your family to buy that candy bar. That's an example of no deviance. Well, Merton then also said there's a lot of people that do engage in deviance. Well, why? So he called those people innovators. innovators believe in the goals of society. They want to have material possessions. They may want to have a home, but they don't necessarily believe in the prescribed means to obtain it. Meaning they're going to look for alternative ways, whether that be a robbery, drug sales, theft, any of those things he didn't label as deviant per se, but just someone innovating because he recognized that a drug dealer or maybe a robber don't necessarily disagree that they want to be successful in society or that they don't need shelter, food, those things. They just don't believe in going about the means to obtain it. Now again, this is his theory. Doesn't mean you have to subscribe to it or believe in it entirely, but I think it's an interesting way to look at it. His next type was a ritualist. And what's interesting for ritualists is he said they don't actually believe in the goals of society at all. They're often very alienated, they're very much an outsider, and so they do believe, though, in the means. They go through the motions. It might be this person that shows up to their job every day just because they say, well, society says I'm supposed to go to work, so I go to work. They don't actually care about the white picket fence and the house at the end. They're simply going through the motions. And so he calls that kind of the social deviance of being alienated or an outsider. And you may know somebody like that in your classes, at work, and you can kind of see that they really are more of that they're just withdrawing and more of a ritualist. Next, he said there's also these retreatists, and a retreatist does not subscribe to the goals nor the means of society. Here you think of folks who are truly alcoholics, a drug addict, a recluse, meaning that they do not want to come out. They may be living in a shack in the woods, even to the furthest extreme of this, but they don't believe in society, and they certainly don't believe in the goals of society, so they often will retreat from society altogether. And his final type is one of the more interesting ones also, which he calls the rebel. And a rebel rejects the goals of society, rejects the means of society, very much like a retreatist, except that they will then create their own new goals and new means to obtain those goals. So in his model, he called this deviance because they're rejecting what society says altogether and instead developing their own goals and means because of rejecting society's. So definitely an interesting way to start to think about his explanation of why people are deviant. If you start to look at some of the other theories, Sutherland has differential association. Here, he says that people learn to be deviant, thus any one of us could become deviant because it's a learned behavior. Again, very different and interesting contrary to Merton's. In Sutherland's, he says a person becomes deviant because the excessive definitions of bad, meaning things that are telling you like go do violations of law, negative norms, those are going to outweigh the good. So if you think about Sutherland's differential association, he really sees it that the more you hang out with people who give you negative or bad definitions, the more likely you are to learn those behaviors versus hanging out with folks that are giving you constant positive and non-deviant definitions are going to often outweigh. So it's really about learned behavior and associations of those around you. There's also this notion of social control, which is really interesting. And so social control, it really begs the question of, instead of focusing on what causes deviance, what causes conformity? What causes people to be conformists versus deviants? So one of the things here is internal social control. Is it you doing it because you yourself have some moral compass, a guide inside of you as to what your norms are? Or is it because of external control? I don't want to get arrested, therefore I don't go through the stop sign. So in internal control, social control, it's because you say, look, I don't run the stop sign because I believe in the law myself. External is I don't run the stop sign because I don't want to be arrested for doing so. So two different ways to look at it. I'm going to dive into one of the theories I'm fascinated by, which is Sykes and Matz's notion of techniques of neutralization as a means of social control. So techniques of neutralization, they come up with a few different ways that explanations or neutralizing of the norms come to be. The first is really denial of responsibility. It's perceived that the act is something beyond his or her control. There's no acceptance of personal responsibility, right? So it wasn't my fault. I was drinking heavily, officer. I was at that party and I didn't mean to drive drunk. I was just way too intoxicated to make a solid decision. You're denying any responsibility. You simply ignore the responsibility that you own. And Sykes and Matza said that's one way people don't see their behavior as deviant and see it as kind of this, well, it's not my problem, not my responsibility. Their second is Denial of injury. So maybe you get a traffic ticket and you say, well, officer, no one was hurt. It wasn't as though I needed to, injure anybody. Nobody was hurt. Just let me get off with a warning. Denying that anybody was injured, therefore somehow the deviance isn't really a problem. The third is denial of the victim, and this one actually gets really scary. That's the idea that, well, they had it coming. That person was a jerk, so I punched them. It starts to deny their basic ability to be seen as a human and have human rights, and that is often a factor in hate crimes. It's really, really troubling because if you don't see the person as human and as deserving of being treated as a human, you can then objectify them, and violence becomes much, much easier. And so this gets into a very scary area. And again, often in a lot of hate crimes, some of the rationale comes up that the perpetrators, don't see the victim as worthy of being a human. Really, really scary stuff. A little less than that, condemnation of condemners. Well, what does that mean? That means, how are you going to judge me? And you try and shift away attention. So great example. You get a cell phone while driving ticket. So you're on your cell phone while driving, and then you see the cop on a cell phone while driving, and you say, well, how are you going to give me a ticket when you yourself were on a ticket how are you going to give me a ticket when you yourself, officer, were on your own phone just minutes ago? So it's not at all acknowledging or recognizing, yes, I did something wrong. It's instead saying you're in no place to judge me. And finally, the last one is an appeal to higher loyalties. This one often is seen sometimes in terrorism and other things. The deviant argues that the standards of higher loyalties or their beliefs justify the act. And this is especially when that person believes that there are inapt or unjust laws. So if you think about protesters who say, look, I understand that you need me to move, but I am saying there's a bigger purpose and I need to be here to represent that. Or if you think about the Japanese warriors that would actually commit suicide, that was an appeal to a higher loyalty. They were being deviant for those particular reasons. Shifting outside of Sykes and Matza for a second, we're going to talk a little bit about Howard Becker and labeling theory. So being labeled as a deviant really is actually dependent upon the perception of others, less so than the actual individual themselves. Becker really talks about two different forms of deviance, one being primary deviance, which is the original behavior that leads to the application of the label. So maybe the very first time you stole something from that store, you were then labeled as deviant or as a thief. That is the primary deviance. If you had no other examples of that before that occurrence, primary. Secondary is that problem of, well, what happens once the label's applied? We label that person as a thief, and then we start to continuously judge them or try and look for reasons to reinforce that label as a thief, and everything we attribute to them then after becomes secondary deviance. We've attributed the label, and now we're attributing all these other behaviors to the label. And one of the interesting things about powers of label, so Rosenhan and the psychiatric patient study of 1973, it's touched on very, very briefly in your text, but certainly want to spend a moment here. Rosenhan said, I want to test this power of how much can a label really dictate or mean. And so he picked a study in which he was going to send psychological patients to a number of hospitals, and all of them were actually healthy patients, but were portraying that they had psychological concerns or problems. They were sent to 12 different hospitals. These pseudo-patients were all admitted for having voices in their head. And all of them immediately stopped showing any signs or symptoms of these voices in their head as soon as they were admitted to these mental institutions. So again, 12 hospitals, all these patients in this study went in claiming they heard voices, none of which were actually hearing the voices. They'd all been deemed to be completely sound, but they wanted to see how strong that label of being a psych patient could be. Well, what do you think happened? Well, the pseudo-patients took part in ward activities. They were speaking to the staff as normal. They delivered and explained that they had no outward signs any longer of this hearing voices in their head. They stopped the moment they were in. When asked how they were feeling by the staff, they said they were fine. They no longer had these things. But each of them were told that they still had to get out by their own devices by convincing the staff they were sane, even though they were showing no symptoms or signs of the delusional voices at all. How long did this go on for? Well, it averaged for each of them between 7 and 52 days before they were released. The average stay was 19 days. And again, all of these people were not actually psychologically unsafe or unsound. They simply had presented with this label of I'm hearing voices in my head and wanted to see how long that label would then stick. So the power of labels is definitely important and why we bring it up, especially when we talk about deviance. Again, there's a lot in this particular chapter, and I would certainly spend some time reading through the text. I hope this gives you a bit of an overview, and I look forward to continuing to talk through deviance as we go through the next chapters.